Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. Thanks for listening. I'm speaking with Ilana C. Myer, author of The Poet King, to be published by, or actually it's been published by Tor Books, March 24th, 2020. And I'll apologize at the start. I haven't read the previous books in the series, but I don't think that should hurt the interview.
Oh, you read the book?
No, I have not yet.
Oh, okay. Because I mean, that's actually pretty unusual for interviewers to read the book, so you're fine.
Oh, okay. First, in the series in general, so this is the third book in the Harp and Ring Sequence. And
yes.
So in general for the series, how did, of all the, writers always have a bunch of ideas, how did this particular idea, this world kind of come to the forefront and get written about instead of all your other ideas?
So, to be honest, I'm not the kind of writer who has like a million ideas at a time. Mm-hmm. I tend to find one, and then if it's strong enough, I become obsessed with that and focus on it for a long time. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened with this series. I was still in college, and I always knew I wanted to write. And I was just coming to understand the financial realities that I was going to be confronting if I wanted to be a writer. Because, when I was a kid, I didn't really get it. I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And mm-hmm. I didn't realize quite how much I would have to put into making it a reality, and also how much I would have to give up. Mm-hmm. And so I was really wrestling with that when I was in college, figuring it out. And then I took this course in Celtic myth and literature. Mm-hmm. And the one of the topics that came up was the literature about the Celtic poets, who had all this political, and they believed as well, magical power in Celtic society, at least in this literature. We don't know how much the society actually believed of these ideas, but in the literature, they believed that if a poet, cursed a king, it would come true. Kings were therefore afraid of poets, and this gave them all this political leverage. And so that kind of gelled for me with what I was wrestling with in terms of being an artist. And I decided that I wanted to explore these feelings I was having about art through the vehicle of this mythology. But because I didn't want it to be necessarily a Celtic novel, because that's like a whole other thing, mm-hmm. I also combined it with the history of the French troubadours. So there's this kind of fusion there going on there. There's kind of the Celtic elements, and there's also the medieval French troubadour elements, mm-hmm. And they come together in Last Song Before Night, which is the first book in the series.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you feel, since you're writing about characters who use poetry, do you feel personally, are you more attracted to poetry, prose? Obviously, the book is prose, but what's the interplay there between your, with your love of poetry versus prose?
So I think of the act of writing as being on a kind of sliding scale, mm-hmm. from poetry to prose, mm-hmm. with variations in between, because I do think about the sound of sentences, the sounds of words as I am writing prose. But of course, the shorter your medium gets, the more attention you have to give to every single word. And that's something I've, always thought about, and I do write poetry sometimes. But in the book itself, there's very little poetry because I'm aware that a lot of fantasy readers just can't stand it when you have a lot of poetry in your book. So okay. I try to keep it minimal and, usually very hyper relevant to what's going on and to the character development.
Mm-hmm. So tell me then about the setting, the protagonist, the world they live in, sort of the conflicts they're dealing with in the third book of the series.
Okay. So I'll try to do that without spoiling the whole series.
Okay.
In the third book begins the ascendancy of a poet who has managed to elevate himself to the position of king, mm-hmm. In the capital city where much of the series has taken place. And it is, in a way, a logical conclusion to the series, because from the beginning, from the first book, there were always these questions about the interplay of art and power, and if it's possible for an artist to have political power without their art becoming something corrupt or artificial, or lacking in some essential quality. And so here we have someone taking the ultimate power, which is the kingship. And the idea is, is it possible for this poet to also, reign as king, and for those things to be those elements to be in harmony? Mm-hmm. I don't know what more I can say without giving away too much.
So I'll ask a couple.
I mean, I think it's a lot of stuff happens. I can say that. Mm-hmm. So what else can I tell you?
So let me ask about certain elements. And again, if any of it might reveal, you don't need to discuss that. But is magic a very prominent in this story? Is it sort of a background thing? And also, what sort of government structures exist in this world? Is it feudal, like medieval type, or what do you have?
Sure. In order to write Last Song Before Night, I did a lot of research, mainly around 12th century France, because of the troubadour inspiration. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the government elements are more medieval. Mm-hmm. Although I did play fast and loose with certain period details, because I figured, as long as the science makes sense internally, it's my world, and I don't have to rely on, strict history. Mm-hmm. So I'll have glass paned windows, even though in the 12th century they would not have, because, whatever, it's okay, in my opinion. Yeah. So, and then in Fire Dance, which is the second book, which was inspired a great deal by the Kingdom of Al-Andalus in Spain. I did a lot of research into that period and the government structure, and the setting reflects that research. Mm-hmm. That's it's about 12th to 13th century Spain. Yeah, there are definitely questions that arise about the value of having an absolute ruler, absolute monarchy, that are explored a little bit. You asked about the magic. Mm-hmm. Well, in this world, poets have access to magical power. This is a theme that begins in the first book and gathers force as the books go on. Mm-hmm. Until, by the time you get to the third, magic plays a very big part. And as the characters often discover, it is usually something not to be trifled with, something very dangerous, mm-hmm. Something which can come at an unbearable cost to the character. Mm-hmm.
Do you have mythical beasts or anything like that in the story, or is it more about the human characters?
I'm really fascinated by humans, so that is where I keep my focus.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you mentioned some of the research you did, in medieval history. Is there any other research that you did, or any places that you went to, or anything else that you gathered to develop this book and write it?
So I initially read a lot of Celtic literature when I was first starting out, as well as all these historical sources. Mm-hmm. When I got to Fire Dance, in addition to reading about Al-Andalus, I was also reading as much as I could about Middle Eastern magic. I read the whole Arabian Nights just to get a taste for the kind of legends that they would have. And in The Poet King, as I delved into the new story, because each book is a new story, I realized that I would be helped by elements from Arthurian literature, as well as Greek mythology. Mm-hmm. I had kind of gone on a kick reading old Homer right before, and that influenced me a lot. Mm-hmm. Especially in The Poet King, we kind of go back to the origin story of the poets and how they began. And there seems to be no better inspiration for that than Homer, who is the earliest poet that we have record of. Of course, we don't know if it was, one person or a bunch of people,
Mm-hmm.
but that idea of the earliest poet seemed very well encapsulated in what we have of the earliest Greek mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was basically just reading as much as I could, not just before working on the books, but also while I was writing them.
I'm just curious, the Middle
Mm-hmm.
Eastern magic, are there any other works or traditions you can mention as far as Middle Eastern magic goes? That's a subject that seems very interesting, and I don't know very much about.
It is interesting, and it was hard for me to find sources in English.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up getting, I forget what this book was called. It was something like The Magic of the Arabian Nights.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like this by some English colonialist guy in the 19th century. And it was what he could gather from talking to people in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But, it was about jinn and, all these different ideas they had about different dimensions. Very cool stuff, really.
Mm-hmm.
Probably if I spoke Arabic, I could have found cooler stuff. But this was, what I was able to glean. And reading Arabian Nights also helped give me an idea of what I was dealing with.
I'm speaking with Ilana C. Myer, author of The Poet King, third book in the Harp and Ring Sequence. You can find her at ilanacmeyer.com. If you like this podcast, please rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. Also, please sign up for my newsletter at crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. YouTube under Cris Alvarez, on Twitter and Facebook at Cris Alvarez FCN, and on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you like military history, please listen to my podcast Military History Inside Out, also located at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you like outer space, business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. Do you recall any interesting cultural differences between the Middle Eastern and maybe Western magical traditions? Maybe something you even included in the books?
I can't think of something offhand because every time I think of something, there's always a parallel.
Okay.
I was more interested in the magical creatures
Mm-hmm.
in Middle Eastern magic than I am, or than I was necessarily
Mm-hmm.
in the Celtic myth. I didn't really get into researching the magical creatures of Celtic myth, whereas in Middle Eastern magic, I became interested in the jinn and the different kinds that there are.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really interesting and helpful for the story.
Okay. So you've mentioned some of the literature, the historical literature and stuff that's inspired the book, or the series and the book, this third volume. How about music, TV, anything like that you look to as sort of an inspiration?
Well, when I was first writing the first book, I was listening to Lorena McKennitt a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually able to keep that up into writing the second book because of her Middle Eastern inspired work.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, I can't think of any specific thing that would have been an inspiration in other media.
Okay. So how about the things that inspire you in general, not for writing this series, but the things that sort of motivate you as you create your art?
Well, I think life experience is probably the main source of inspiration. And by that, I don't mean that what happens to me, I put on the page, nor am I my characters. But it's more that as I process life events, I have more material for the art that I'm creating. That it actually is for me a kind of necessary method of dealing with life experiences.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Would you say, so just kind of exploring the aesthetic or the feel, the atmosphere of the book, and I'll focus on the third one. Is there any, would you say that the book, could you imagine it having a soundtrack of any type? Like what would you, musically, what do you feel like the book what kind of attitude the book has?
That's an interesting question. I would say probably sometimes kind of melancholy, always pretty intense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sort of a classical soundtrack, so to speak.
Maybe. I mean, I find classical music to sometimes be a little detached for me, but yeah, something more melancholy and intense would seem like that seems like the elements that would characterize the soundtrack.
Would you say, does the book have sort of, does it have any kind of a dark feel to it? You know, it's dealing with these major sort of political issues. Is it particularly intense in any way in that regard?
I do go to dark places.
Mm-hmm. As far as writing, the process of writing itself, do you do anything maybe out of the ordinary to complete your work, or either the drafts or the first draft or maybe the final?
I think every writer has their own process. And, you know, in some ways we look to other writers as our peril when we're trying to figure out our own way of doing it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if what I do is unusual. For me, you know, one thing that I have had to come to terms with is that it takes me some time to write my books. Mm-hmm. The shortest that it's ever taken was 2 years. That was The Poet King. And I think it only took 2 years because there had been all this buildup of story and development from the previous 2 books. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of resigned to the fact that it takes me a while, and there are authors who write 2 books a year, and I'm just like, yeah, that's nice, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
Well, how has your approach to writing changed over time, over the course of the 3 books? Have you changed anything that you do?
I think what's changed the most is that I have more of a conscious understanding of how I work. Mm-hmm. At this point, I sit down and I go, okay, I'm going to do this thing that I have done a lot because, you know, this seems to be where it works for me. Whereas in the past, I was, you know, just figuring out how I work. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely some value to that because, you know, once you've already done it, you can look back and draw courage from the fact that you have done it before.
Yeah, definitely. Have you done other work outside of writing, you know, novels, other work that's influenced how or what you write? Any other jobs or careers?
Well, I was a journalist in Jerusalem in my 20s. Mm-hmm. But I really, whatever influence that might have had on my writing is invisible to me personally. Mm-hmm. It did teach me really valuable lessons, one of which was the value of research and asking questions, because I came to realize that the facts are very often not what we intuitively might think. Mm-hmm. Did that help me for writing fiction? I mean, it's really hard to say, but I tend to think it's always best to know as much as possible about everything. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I've just been an administrative assistant, writing content for websites, just really, really tedious things just to make the rent. So, you know, everything was always very focused on supporting myself, so that I could work on my novel in my spare time, which turned out to be not very much time, but that's another story.
Yeah. So, and again, for this next question, you don't have to go into details or reveal anything, but, or actually maybe the whole series in general, was there much that you had to take out once you had written your rough draft? Did you write more than you needed and pull back a lot, or how did that work?
Well, with each book, it was different. I certainly did cut a lot in the first book. You know, I just, I'm trying to remember now why. It was mainly like line edits that I'm not sure most people would notice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I've definitely had to write a lot of stuff that I cut. Mm-hmm. But that was usually part of the drafting process. Not so much that I had written too much, but that, by writing, I discovered something that I wanted to do differently.
So you didn't have to remove any characters who turned out to not be useful or any particular events or anything?
Certainly with the first book, there was a lot of revision, and it's hard to remember all of it now because it was the book I cut my teeth on, the one that I learned to write a novel from writing. So, for that first book, I wrote 100,000 words and then threw out like 90% of it and started again.
Okay. Wow.
So, I don't really remember what was in it anymore. Like, if I were to look at it, I'd be so embarrassed. But I think I had to write it to get to what I ended up writing. And, with the other books, there's always been stuff that I threw out, but never as dramatically as the first time around.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this is a bit of a whimsical question, but when you were young, was there any superpower technology or maybe a fictional setting that you yearned to have or be a part of?
Oh, I definitely wanted to visit Middle-earth.
Yeah. Did you see yourself as a particular character in Middle-earth, or you would just be a human getting to know what was going on?
I just wanted to wander in the woods of Lorien. That was really all I wanted to do.
And that's a very poetic series.
Yes.
So apart from the edits that we talked about, were there any difficulties in finishing this book and getting it published? Or I guess as a third volume of a series, you're pretty much established as far as getting it published. But were there any issues that you had to deal with?
So that third book actually went, well, I'm saying it went smoothly, but I remember the first year was hell, but whatever,
Oh, wow.
The hardest part for me is always figuring out a way into the book. And then as I go, I build momentum. Yeah, and by the time I got to the end, I had, more or less figured out where I was going. So that part wasn't the most difficult. The most difficult part is usually figuring out what is this story and what is the heart of this story. Because, you can write a series of events, but to me, that's pretty meaningless. At the risk of stating the obvious, the story should be about something. And finding what the story is about can be challenging, especially in the case of this series where each book really is about something else. So it's not like, the book is just continuing where the other one left off and that's it.
And again, without revealing anything, in the third book, did you have certain expectations of what the characters would emotionally, how they would behave and react to things? Or did you come across, did the characters sort of change in a way you didn't expect?
I'm always kept on my toes a little bit by character responses to things. But I had a pretty firm hand in this book on where it was going. There were things that I had mapped out from the second book that I already knew I wanted. There was maybe one character who surprised me continuously from the second book to the third, but I can't really say more than that.
Okay. Is this the final book in the series, or will it continue?
This is the end I had in mind for this to be the ending.
Okay.
I think a trilogy is a lovely structure, and there's no reason to mess with it.
Okay. So no prequels or sequels or anything like that in mind?
Not in mind. I mean, I guess you never know what's going to happen.
Right.
But don't get me started on prequels.
So, do you have, are you working on a new writing project? Do you have something in mind that you can talk about, or?
I am trying to work on something now. I'm in that early stage, which for me is the worst. And I can't talk about it yet because it's too early. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know if I'll get a contract for it. But I'm after about a year of researching some new stuff, I'm working on something else.
Since you had been a journalist, do you have any interest in writing nonfiction works in the future, or are you sticking to fiction? Or again, I don't want you to reveal anything that you don't want to, but
Oh, I understand. No, it's very easy for me to answer that. For me, the journalism was a way to support myself. It was never what I wanted to do. For me, it's always been about writing books, and that's what I hope to continue doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So where can people find you online? Do you have webpage, social media?
I'm on Twitter. I don't know if I should direct people there because I'm not very diplomatic, but my handle is Ilana CT. Mm-hmm. I also have a website, Ilana C. Myer, where I try to update periodically.
Okay, and I'll spell that for listeners. ILANACMYER, and is it .com?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final words or thoughts?
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for speaking with me. Thank you for listening. You can find more interesting information like this on CrisAlvarez.com or FullContactNerd.com. You can also find the podcast on your favorite podcast feed under the title Full Contact Nerd. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please remember to rate this podcast. It really helps. We're on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on YouTube under Cris Alvarez, on Facebook under Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and on Twitter at Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.